Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Incorrect Politics. Today we are going to discuss the safe states. So if you actually have a tradition to watch the videos to all those political analysis people, not just like me, but maybe like Let's Talk Election or maybe Ready Go Politics, which is actually the reason why I'm starting doing this video and this entire channel, then you oftenly see that they usually click on California, Oregon, Washington, and then Illinois, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, District of Columbia, basically the entire part in this sidebar. And there's Hawaii, which is also a safe Democratic state. It will pretty much be all. Sorry, and Maine's first congressional district, that will also be safe. And the remainder part, they will start with Republican ones. So Republicans has Idaho, Wyoming. Montana is actually a tricky one. I'm going to just leave it as a lean here. So it's not always given. And Utah, North Dakota, South Dakota, basically entire middle ground. Nebraska, usually the second one will be left blank. And Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, and West Virginia. And that's pretty much all of the in terms of Republican safe states. And Alaska is another case where it's usually rated as safe, but Let's Talk Election channel has started to recently move Alaska into a more like a lean column because last time Donald Trump only carried the state by only around 10.1 percentage point. Alright, so that's pretty much all of the so-called safe states. Have you ever wondered that if these states were always as consolidated as it has been on, at least in our mouth or in our modern history? Well, it's certainly not the case because if we actually look into the different map, today these safe states, they are actually having different types of margin. Some of them are within 15 points, some of them are like 30, 40 points, or even like District of Columbia, which I don't believe I need to specify. In 1984 election, where Ronald Reagan won 525 electoral votes, which is everything except Minnesota and District of Columbia. District of Columbia voted Walter Mondale as president for around a 90 to 10 margin, which is exactly the same amount of margin as it usually votes to the Democratic candidate. So there are some non-movers. And for Republican side, the only state that I can say that it has always been so solid for Republican, I'll probably say Wyoming. Because the last time Wyoming voted for a Democratic president was Lyndon Johnson's second term, which was in around 1964 or 68, correct me if I'm wrong. So Wyoming itself is a staunch Republican state. Aside from that, you can't really compare any Republican state to District of Columbia because there really isn't a state which voted stably 85 to 90% for one certain party around the special district, and that's the reason why DC statehood is a no-no for Republican. But that's beyond the topic of our discussion today. Today we are going to talk about these safe states and when they were not used to be so safe, and what could actually happen when these safe states were no longer safe states. Well, to begin with, some of the states actually have this kind of interesting charisma because, for example, I used to point it out in my first video that Texas itself would be rated as a safe state 2 election cycles ago, and Arizona would always been clicked as a safe state in this situation, and Georgia would have been a safe state back in I would say 2 election cycles ago. Well, Arizona, Texas, and Georgia, they were not by a safe state. Well, by saying safe state, I mean a 20-point margin by any means, even in 2008 or 2004 when Bush was still running for his re-election. Well, when our political commentators were clicking on the so-called safe states, they're usually referring to the states that has a no chance to flip. So safe and lean's differences is not in terms of 20 point or 10 point. It's more like between safe means it wouldn't flip and leans means it would flip. Because for example, the state of Iowa, it's considered a battleground state in recent elections like in 2016 and 2020, but Iowa actually is a around 9-point victory for Donald Trump for both of his terms. By that standard, Iowa should have been categorized as a safe state because Arizona's one election cycle ago, it was a 7 or 8-point victory for Republican, yet it was categorized as a safe state because back then Arizona has a streak voting history to vote for Republican candidates, and basically everyone assumes that Arizona has been voting that way for more than 30 years. It will continue to remain that way way. And the reason why Iowa isn't is because Barack Obama carried Iowa in 2008, and people were considering as having a voting origin to vote both Democratic and Republican. So the so-called safe state status could be greatly affected by their voting history. Alright, so when was the last time these states were not so safe? Well, I have another graph for you to watch now. This is the graph I'm trying to present to. So you can see on this screen the solid safe red states were the ones that I consider the true safe states. So in these true safe states, which is North Dakota, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, the 10 states which constitutes 61 electoral votes were the true Republican safe states in the 2020 election, because all of them were carried by Donald Trump by at least 20 percentage point. The rest of them, despite it being considered so safe, it is actually not safe at all. We can look at some example. Alaska was carried by 10 points, and I believe that a lot of people were actually pointed that Alaska is gradually shifting leftward. It actually shifted about 25 points more Democratic since it was last voted Republican in its most extreme margin. And for Kansas actually has a Democratic governor, so you can't really say that Kansas is, well, certainly people will still say that Kansas is very likely going to vote Republican at least in next 1 or 2 election cycles. But Kansas has a chance to go Democrat at certain time given the right candidate and given the right situations. And the so-called things apply to Missouri, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Just recently, a lot of Democratic money were poured inside the state of South Carolina to try to unseat Lindsey Graham, but well, eventually that effort was deemed useless. But still, South Carolina is a state that isn't as consolidated as many people would have think when they're clicking on the so-called safe states. Well, Utah is actually a trickier one because Utah sometimes could go leans because Utah is a state that has a very strong third-party voting record. Well, Johnson won more than 20%. Sorry, not Johnson, but the Mormon guy. Well, Evan McMullin won more than 20% of the votes in the state of Utah in 2016. But still, Donald Trump won that state by around 20 points. So this time he still carried Utah by around 25 or 30 points or so. So it's still a true safe state, I would say. Well, on the Democratic side, the thing is more interesting. People are saying that California and New York were the home of the liberals. Yes, they actually are by this standout of this graph because they are staunch blue states. California voted Democratic by almost 30 points in 2020 election. It hasn't always been used this way. In 2000, Bush were talking about having a chance to contest in California. Well, of course, at that time, California is already leaning Democratic, but it has not been that leaning to the point where it's already a safe blue state. Well, but New York, the same case. Vermont, the same case. But Vermont, it's actually a tricky one because Phil Scott, the governor there, is a Republican. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, basically the sidebar that I just mentioned were mostly in the safe Democratic column. But some of them are not so strict for Democrat. Well, first of all, I'm going to take off Pennsylvania from the board. I don't know why I clicked it. Maybe while I was clicking New Jersey, I just accidentally clicked on it. But Illinois, a state that voted for a Democrat by only 16 points. You might be surprised because, well, Illinois is supposed to be, when last time Donald Trump won in 2016, every state that is bordering Illinois were voting Republican. Wisconsin voted Republican, Indiana voted Republican, Kentucky voted Republican, Missouri Republican, Iowa Republican. Well, Minnesota was not Republican, but first it was voted to Democrat by less than 2 percentage points, and second, it doesn't border Illinois. But Illinois itself is actually not as democratic as you might believe because in 2014, which is a red wave year, there is a senator named Mark Kirk. So Kirk actually won the Senate election in Illinois as a Republican there. And there's actually some representative from the state of Illinois which is Republican. And still, there is still one. Well, there's still more than one. One of them is Adam Kinzinger, which voted to convict President Donald Trump, but that's beyond the point again. So what I'm trying to say is, you might say that Illinois is an auto gain for a Democrat, but it really isn't. It is actually only a lean margin if you consider a lean margin actually from 10 points to 20 points. Well, some of the states were on the reverse side. The state of Alaska and Texas, as we just mentioned, were on the flip side of it. Well, but actually, it's actually interesting if you have seen the 538 graph. They used to have that graph which they put from the most Democratic state to the most Republican state in the Snell graph. And that one, you can see that some of the safe states we automatically pressed were not so safe, like New Jersey. New Jersey was carried by Joe Biden by 15.94 percentage point. In contrast, Colorado, which people used to consider it as a swing state, and it still is a swing state by name in 2016, well, lesser and lesser people were thinking that it is a true swing state. Most say it's a Democratic leaning, but they still believe that this state is not a state that is, well, a given state for a Democrat. But you know what? In New Jersey, Joe Biden carried the state by 15.94 points. In Colorado, Joe Biden carried the state by 13.5 points. That's only a 2-point difference merely. So Colorado is almost as Democratic as New Jersey is. Yet New Jersey is the state that is in the New England, and Colorado is just a state that were used to be considered as a battleground state. So that's actually an interesting thing. And Minnesota had come to a point where it was considered a battleground state. But Minnesota hasn't always been that way. In 1984, it was the only state that Walter Mondale carried. So Minnesota was considered as a given state for Democrats in the early 1984 to 90. Yet Minnesota shifted rightward pretty fast, and soon it lost its status. So now we don't automatically click on Minnesota. Starting from now on, we're going to discuss what kind of force will push a state away from its safe state status. So there are actually two kinds of shifting, and one of them is not what we're going to discuss today. So the first one is the national shifting, meaning that the entire national environment was shifting in favor for one certain party. For example, again, in 1984 election, Ronald Reagan carried the entire state, won the entire presidential election by 525 electoral vote landslide. At that case, even Massachusetts go red, even Maryland go red. Basically, you can just consider the entire map were being dropped inside a red paint, so the entire map go red. So you can't really see the so-called the force moving a safe state away from it, because that's just like if you put an apple going against, let's say, Barack Obama, then obviously Barack Obama is going to carry even like states like Wyoming by a 95 percentage point. That doesn't mean that Wyoming isn't a safe state for Republican, but some of the states were not under this so-called national shift case, in which I will name it as individual shift. And one of the most fascinating examples of individual shift is West Virginia. So if we actually look at the recent presidential election result of West Virginia, you can see it's basically a reverse from 1976 all the way down to 2020. Well, in 1976, Republican garnered 42% of the vote in West Virginia, and the Democratic Party won 58.1%. We might think that it's just a 42-point to 58-point difference, right? But actually, that margin is bigger than Illinois of today, which I just said that Illinois went to President Biden by only 16 points. So West Virginia were considered a very safe state back in 1976, but just look at the shift it is. 1980, Democrats lose the vote. It dropped down to 50 percentage point for the first time. 84, well, basically you can say 84 and 88, it has a dramatic shift because Ronald Reagan were on the ballot. In 1988, George Bush would try to carry on the legacy of Ronald Reagan. He's also on the ballot, so that's a great appealment. So these 2 years, I'll call this a national shift that causes West Virginia to go so rightward. By 1992, when there is Ross Perot trying to split the vote against Mr. Bush, and in 1996, another Perot splitting the vote away from Bob Dole, the Republican nominee, lose a lot of votes. This one, I wouldn't say it's a regression because I just mentioned it's a third party, and the third party has a significant amount of vote away. But for 2000, people were actually saying that the reason why Republican won the election in 2000 is because West Virginia, once considered a Democratic stronghold, went to the Republican Party. Actually, if you actually go onto YouTube and search for the 2000 election night coverage, you will see that at that time the commentators were saying that West Virginia has always been voting Democratic. It's a Democratic stronghold. And no one was expecting that the West Virginia itself have went from a safe state status, because last election it went to Bill Clinton by 15 percentage point. 15 percentage point for Clinton to 5-point victory for President Bush. That's a 20-point shift. Basically, it never happened so dramatically. So there must have been something that caused the West Virginia to go rightward by 20 percentage points. Well, one of the reasons is because of the third party candidate, as this big bracket has shown. But there's another reason. And another reason is West Virginia is losing population, and West Virginia is in the Rust Belt state. Well, not necessarily on the Rust Belt state as we usually call Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, but West Virginia is a heavy manufactured-based state, and these states rely heavily on the so-called traditional energies, and the Democratic Party has been shifting increasingly leftward when they push out their energy platform, their environmental platform, and their so-called Green Deal platform that usually starts to emerge starting from the 21st century. And those kind of policies, which is basically for any growing adult in West Virginia, they'll feel like, well, you're just talking stories, you're not making fortunes by your own hands. And they're alienating the voters in West Virginia. So starting from that point onward, West Virginia go increasingly Republican. And that is one reason you can push a safe Democratic state into a safe Republican state. You might argue that West Virginia itself is a slow shifting, right? Because even though we say there's a 20-point bump, but if you disconsider this part, which is around 10 points, that's still only a 10-point shift. We see a 6-point shift of Arizona and Georgia in this election. So that 10-point shift isn't that dramatic enough. You might more as well say this is a safe state transformation, not a safe state direct shift or direct turn away from the safe state status. Well, another reason that you might see an individual shift that is so dramatic but not caused by a gradual difference of population, because in state of Alaska and state of Utah, they have a very heavy third-party influence. Well, not necessarily third party. In Utah, the case is Mormon, and in Alaska, the case is the Native Americans. So there are different cases where these states might vote overwhelmingly for their candidate instead of for the consensus that this state usually vote. For example, the state of Alaska is usually voting Republicans, but if there is Alaska independent candidate, he usually can gather 10% or 20% of the vote, or if it runs as an independent, maybe 5 to 10%, and that could actually change a bit in terms of the electoral map. But maybe not that dramatic to put Alaska in a completely toss-up column, but well, certainly that's one case where the safe state could shift into a lean or likely column. And another one is the individual appealment, but that usually don't apply to presidential level. For example, in the state of Hawaii, Hawaii's governor had always been Democratic instead of in early 21st century when Linda Lingle were elected as the governor of Hawaii for 2 consecutive terms. Well, back in that time, Hawaii actually has 4 different distinct islands. No, not 4, but 4 districts. Well, not 4 districts either. Usually we cut them into 4 electoral districts. So this is 1, this is 1, this is 1, and this is 1. Usually in the early Hawaii state history, only the second island is considered a leaning Republican island, and the remaining 3 were all Democratic. And for all of the time, it has only remained this way. Sometimes even the second island defected to the Democratic column. But there is one election where Linda Lingle ran against the Democratic governor nominee, where she actually flipped all 4 islands into a Republican column, and that is a case where a safe Hawaii state suddenly switched to a Republican state. Same thing can apply to all those New England governors election. New Hampshire, Vermont, they all went from a safe Democratic state into a red Republican state in terms of governor level. But that's usually not likely to happen on presidential level. So the individual shift could happen, but it only happens when you can call out a reason. If you cannot call out a reason, then you probably shouldn't expect that for overnight Illinois suddenly become competitive for Republicans, or maybe not North Carolina, or maybe South Carolina become a battleground state as close as North Carolina. So that will be all of the video for today. If you do like it, you may like, share, and subscribe to my channel. You can comment down below for your thoughts, and I'm signing out for today. Have a great day. Goodbye.